I'm very looking forward to my discussion with my friend Jenny Xiao. She is currently the assistant professor at University of Washington, Tacoma. She received her PhD degree in social psychology from New York University. I hope I can learn more about what we are experiencing psychologically in this pandemic. Hope you enjoy as well.
We can get started.
Hello, hi, Jenny. It's so good to see you again, and I hope you're doing well with your family. And thank you so much for being my guest. Um, for me, I'm always very, very curious about you know psychology in general. And now you're a professor. Can you please share about your area of expertise?
Yes, so I'll kind of go back in time a little bit. I first received my bachelor's degree with a double major in psychology and biology from Bard College. So we went to college together, and we were actually kind of the same year, so we overlapped a lot. And then immediately after college, I went to New York University to receive both my master's and PhD in social psychology from there. And then in 2016, that's when I received my PhD. I started my first academic position at Macalester College as a visiting assistant professor for a year before I moved on to Hofstra University on Long Island, again back in New York, as an assistant professor in psychology. But I was also only briefly there for 1 year before I moved again to the West Coast. So now I'm an assistant professor in psychology in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at University of Washington, Tacoma. So this is my second year here as an assistant professor. I teach classes in social psychology and psychology in general, and also do research in this area. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you and talk about how my work and my field in general can really help us understand this ongoing pandemic that's really affecting all of us globally. So just a little bit of a brief background. I'm a social psychologist. My training is in experimental social psychology, on how we perceive, react to our world and our environment. So in terms of how the field of social psychology, or even in terms of how social sciences in general can really help us understand what we're experiencing in this pandemic, I would like to first of all just say that we're social scientists. We're not, really medical doctors or epidemiologists. And I actually think, it's really important to point out that we can understand this pandemic from a different perspective, but we're not here to give medical advice, right? So I think there are experts that are better suited for that. So in social psychology, we try to understand the psychological mechanisms underlying social phenomena, right? So some examples might be, why do we see, for instance, prejudice and discrimination? What are the psychological roots of those tendencies and sentiments? For instance, in my work, if you have a certain identity or social identity, how does that affect the way you see the world and interact with the world? And an example, I kind of thought about in terms of how we can help or really help us understand this pandemic. And like I said, for instance, a medical doctor or epidemiologist might be able to give us advice on whether we should wear a mask, right? Whether we should social distance. What is the appropriate social distance? Or maybe physical distance is a better term, in my opinion, because the term social really means this social connection. We as social scientists or social psychologists might be able to help with how to get people to wear masks or how to get people to social distance. And we know that there's actually a lot of resistance, right? People who push back and don't really adhere to health guidelines, right? Don't want to wear a mask, for instance. And that's really interesting from a social psychological perspective, right? We know that we live in a country, or at least in a culture, where wearing a mask is not normative, right? We don't do it on a daily basis, but now all of a sudden we're asking people to, right? In terms of that very quick behavioral change, it's not easy, right? It's not easy to change people's habits all of a sudden. So I think as social scientists, there's a lot of research that could help us understand and promote positive behavioral change, right? So, for instance, can you actually try to change the social norms surrounding wearing a mask, as opposed to really just educating people about the benefit of it or how effective it is, right? So sometimes, changing social norms, or at least people's perceived social norms, might even have a more powerful benefit or powerful effect, depending on, the actual behavior and who you're talking to. So, that's just one example. But I think as a social scientist or as a social psychologist, those are the areas that we can, I think our research and work and understanding of the human mind, right, can help with what we're experiencing in this pandemic.
Right. And, as a musician, I'm more curious with, how this situation might change, our general behavior patterns. As you can tell that we are all relying on technology now to communicate with one another. I wonder, well, in your opinion, do you think over time this might increase or decrease our need for human contact? And also, would it affect industries such as performing art or any maybe public service?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually read somewhere, it was kind of a meme or a quote saying, imagine surviving this pandemic without music, books, movies, performances, right? So that's why you should support the performing arts, or just arts in general, right? Like any form of arts and performance. And that really spoke to me. I think nowadays, I would probably predict that during a pandemic like this, we actually have an increased need for arts, performance in general, right? I know although we have to do this digitally now, all the performances are canceled. But as a family, we have actually watched more performances that were streamed, live, which I think was, great. It was made free, right? So I think now we are at a time where we need to rely on those technology, and it's unfortunate because, as anyone who has gone to a concert or performance knows that experience is just not the same when you're watching a recording, right? That's why we have music halls. That's why we have, those venues. And I actually have a little daughter who's been taking ballet classes for almost 3 years now, 2-3 years, and we take her to ballet performances a lot. And unfortunately, this year we can't. However, I think from a psychological perspective, I think we have an increased need for arts and human connection in general, right? In terms of your question about whether, if the pandemic ends soon, right, would we be more likely to go back to performances? I would say that will depend on really a few things, right? First of all, how long this process goes on, for this pandemic goes on, right? I think the longer it is, the more likely that we'll actually really see a long-term effect in how our habits, you know, our habits and our behaviors. If it's relatively short term, I don't think it will have a really big effect on what we would do after the pandemic. But in terms of these large gatherings, I do, you know, even from a psychological perspective, I think there is that sense of fear of contamination that's very psychological, even if, let's say, you know, we have a vaccine or we have a treatment and we're allowing these large gatherings. I think that very psychological element of fear of contamination might still continue. And you know, you hear anecdotes and stories about this, people saying, you know, now I don't want to hug another person, right? I don't want to get close to another person. And I think that's very psychological. As humans, we don't always make rational decisions about our behavior, right? Even when we know, well, maybe it's safe, right? Let's say we're at a time when it's safe to go back to our normal life, that psychological effect might still linger on. And you might say that's irrational, but as humans, we're always making irrational choices, and our behaviors are, you know, as a social psychologist, I might say we're kind of never really making completely rational decisions. We're not machines, right? We're not programmed like a computer where we, you know, performed based purely on reason. So I think I do see there's that fear of people not wanting to go back to how we do things. And there's a fear of large gatherings. There might be a fear of physical contact or connection. But you know, I think you know, that's where, again, I think social science could come in and design interventions, right? And for combating those fears or psychological effects.
That's very interesting. Do you think, you know, for maybe even like a private setting, you know, even, you know, among friends or family members, people also will have that kind of fear, or it only apply to large gathering?
Yeah, you know, I think that's interesting. I haven't actually thought about that a lot, but I've been thinking more about this large gatherings, and especially when it's a stranger, right? I think with family and friends, you have maybe sometimes even that false sense of security, right? Because if you think about it, any stranger you meet on the street, or if you go to a concert and you sit next to a stranger, that person is probably not more likely to be a carrier, right? Let's say of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, compared to, let's say, a friend.
Yeah.
Right? A friend, you know, your friend might just be as likely to go out to the grocery store and catch it, or, you know, let's hope not. But I think, again, psychologically speaking, people are probably more concerned about a stranger compared to a family member or a friend. But again, like I said, that concern is irrational, right? If you really consider the probabilities, and I think from a lot of research, we know that people really overestimate the likelihood of bad things happening to others and not themselves, right? So it's kind of this it doesn't apply to me, right? I'm not gonna catch the virus. You know, it's someone else's might, but you know, I think it even maybe speaks to my own experience a little bit, right? You kind of feel that false sense of security. So my prediction would be that people are probably going to feel more secure with with people they know, but that sense of security may not be justified.
It's irrational.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
I see. Well, thank you. And my next question is, obviously, you know, nowadays a lot of performing artists, we cannot really contribute directly to the society by having live performances. And I think many of us probably are experiencing some sort of like a change of identity. So what would you know, suggest people who are now currently being laid off, how would you sort of help us to maybe cope with the new sort of identity?
Yeah, first of all, I actually want to say I think artists are still very much contributing to the society in whatever way they are, right? I think back to, in addition to like the live performances we've watched, the concert, I don't know if you watched it, but the Lady Gaga organized, right, a few weeks ago. I think it was watched by many, and a lot of us really found, in addition to just enjoyment, but a lot of sense of community. But I knew when I was watching that, a lot of my friends were also watching it, right? So we could connect in that way. So I will first just say, I think artists and performers are contributing, just not, like you said, right, not in the same way of live performances, kind of in person. In terms of this identity issue, I think, the way I see your identity or your social identity is, it's really a very psychological or abstract concept. So, what I would argue is during this time when you have a pandemic, there's a lot of threat otherwise, right? So I kind of think about a lot of this in terms of the threat in your environment, right? You're threatened by the virus, to your health, to your well-being, to your income, to our society at large. And we know that when we're threatened, we tend to actually really cling onto the identities that we have, among other things, right? So, I actually think this is a time when it's really crucial to have identities that value, that are very meaningful to you, right? So as an artist, I know, for instance, you and many others, for you, this artist identity is crucial to your self-concept, right? That's who you are. Although they may not be the only identity, right? For any of us, there are many identities that are important, right? For me, maybe my identity as a social scientist, my identity as a teacher, educator, my identity as a mother, right? Those are all identities that are very important to me. And I would say at this difficult, challenging time, it's our psychological tendency is to actually show really increased identity, not a decreased identity. Also, our identities are, they can be really devoid of these real physical experience, where it could be purely abstract, right? So for instance, right, for an artist, I could imagine really connecting with your artist friend, really, even just thinking a lot about why you became an artist in the first place, right? What are those essential things that are essential to this identity, in addition to being able to perform, right? Of course, being able to perform, I would say it's probably, one of the important things, but there are many other things that you could, that could help build this identity of an artist. So, like I said, I personally really value, performing arts. I'm just a really big fan. I don't do any performing arts myself, but I've always been interested, and it's been part of my life. And for instance, for me, even I could even have an identity associated with the performing arts because I enjoy watching and listening. So I think that's my take on this. And in terms of the really realistic difficulties, for instance, being laid off, right? That's just very realistic. I think there are many structural things we need to work on in order to remedy those real difficulties. But if we're talking about a psychological effect or identity related issues, there are many other ways to feel an increased identity at this time.
If you don't mind, can you please maybe just summarize what some tips, for, it's not just for performing artists, I'm sure for many other public servers, they, when, nowadays they have to deal with this sort of identity crisis. What more can you suggest? in
Mm-hmm.
terms of,
Yeah, if we talk about really concrete tips, I think, like I said, connecting with the roots of what this field or what this identity really means to you. What does it mean to be an artist? I'm sure there are many other things in addition to being able to perform.
Mhm.
Connecting with others who have a shared identity, I think is really important at this time. Right? I've found personally a lot of comfort in connecting with people who are kind of in the same
Community.
situation with a shared identity. I think that those are the two main ones I can think of. And again, like I said, I think we need structural change too, just in order to remedy the realistic impact.
Right.
Mm.
Thank you. I guess now we are also dealing with like increased sort of discrimination against Asian population. Um, would you maybe share some of your insights and how you think
Mhm.
we can cope with that?
Yes. So, I think about this a lot because some of my work also looks at these sort of negative social behaviors and attitudes. And we know just there's data showing there's such a drastic increase in reports of discrimination against the Asian community or Asian American community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there are many. It really reminds me of really the anti-Muslim sentiments that this country showed, or at least some individuals showed after the September 11th. Right, so it's kind of I see a lot of similarities there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of scapegoating, right? When we have these really strong threats, when we feel threatened, we kind of lash out at a group that we think is relevant to the threat. Right. So I think that's what's happening, at least partially what's happening with this anti-Asian sentiment after the COVID-19 started. I also, just in terms of threats, again, when we know that when we feel threatened, there is that increased in-group affiliation or in-group kind of protection, and then also increased out-group exclusion, right? So if you see the Asian community as an out-group at this time, and particularly, again, an out-group that you think might be relevant or related to this COVID-19, right? That just becomes an easy target for you to exclude, discriminate, express those emotions, negative emotions that are related to the threat. So in a way, it's really unfortunate, but I think psychologically, from a psychological perspective, I'm not surprised, right? So I wish I didn't see it, but I'm also not surprised just based on what we know about how people react in these kinds of situations. But I'm also happy to see, I think I've seen a lot of activism around this, right? People really speaking up, and allies from other communities. Of course, there's a lot of activism from the Asian American community, but I've also seen allies from other groups, other ethnic, racial groups, which helps a lot. I think having members outside of this community becoming allies and supporting the Asian American community, condemning these discrimination and prejudice that's increased at this time, has been great to see. So, I think I hope we continue to be educated on this topic, why we have these reactions we might have and how to effectively combat those negative behaviors.
I hope so too. Yeah. So now I'm also wondering, in terms of on a global scale, um, do you think we might face more nationalism?
That's a very relevant, I think, interesting question, and pretty relevant to that last question about this
Yeah.
anti-Asian sentiment. And here you just can't not mention how our president has really responded to this pandemic, really calling the virus the Chinese virus, really just in the last couple of days, issuing, more tweets on, I think what he said was, I know the Asian American community is also angry at China, right? So really kind of pitting people against each other. I think there's, that probably contributes to this nationalism, right? I think there's, in his tweets, I'm seeing a lot of pitting countries against each other, right? Blaming other countries for what's happened, which I really don't think is the effective thing to do when it's a time that we're all suffering globally and the virus doesn't discriminate based on nationality. I would probably predict an increase, if you survey people now, an increased nationalism. Again, I'm going to actually use the September 11th as an example, right after. That's a very different kind of threat, right? It was actually a threat that really triggers your American identity in some way. We did see after September 11th, a really drastic increase for the support for Bush at the time. And this is kind of a trend that we do expect to see, right? People actually cling onto their existing system more after these threats. They support their existing system more, and that could include their country. Right? So I would not be surprised if there's increased level of nationalism or just support for people, their own country at this time. And that's not being helped by a president who really intentionally pits countries against each other. So I think this ties in with with the last question you asked. When we do see these threats, we're just more likely to be protecting of our own group, right? That group might be your country, it might be your racial group, and that kind of comes with this exclusion of our group, of other, right? The other in this case, and that other could be Asian American community, that other could be other countries, and I think physically we're seeing a lot of countries closing their physical borders to others, right? So I think it's probably not surprising that if you're closing physical borders, that has some sort of effect on, just your attitudes towards other countries than your own country at this time.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, this sounds, this is very insightful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on it. Maybe perhaps there's some silver lining. Maybe you can share something that possibly can, change our behavior in a maybe more positive way.
Yeah, so I do think, we're all looking for silver linings at this time. I think there are many. This is not just in general positive behavior, but I was actually reading a friend's tweet the other day and saying how, we're all, especially for those of us who have little kids, and again, this speaks to, I try to find comfort in connecting with others who are also in a similar situation, right? You're stuck with your kids at home. It's difficult. But you're also learning so much about your kids that you don't get to otherwise, right? So we don't get to spend all this time, and we probably never will get to spend this time with our little ones. So, that's like a silver lining for me. But I think in terms of the bigger picture for everybody or for our society at large, I think anytime something like this happens, it's a time for change, right? It's an opportunity for change. I think there are social changes, normative changes that would otherwise take years and years to happen, could happen very quickly at this time. I think people also could feel socially responsible or more socially responsible, right? When for some people, when they think about whether they wear a mask when they go out to the public, they are thinking about, what if I'm a carrier? I want to protect others if I'm a carrier that I don't know, right? So I think people are being more conscious about these socially responsible behaviors. I know people who are thinking more about the environment, right?
Yes.
Seeing how the environment has changed now that
Yeah.
humans are aside, right? So I think those are all really positive silver linings. With that said, maybe I'm always talking about the negative, but social change could happen both ways, right? We're also seeing possibly some governments really pushing for social change that aren't so positive in the short time, right? Those changes could take years to happen if it weren't for the pandemic. So I think, if we look on the bright side, there are many things that are flexible, malleable, and being changed at this time that are silver linings of this pandemic.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like I learned quite a lot just from this really brief conversation with you, and I hope you and your family have a wonderful time, and now you can spend more time with your daughter and teach her how to I guess play music soon. Maybe.
Yeah, I hope, thank you so much again for having me. I hope you and others, artists, musicians, kind of find joy still at this time, and just know that you are really valuable to our society and our culture. So I hope you also find, creative ways to still showcase your work at this
Thank
time.
you. Thank you so much.